The following contains references to isolation, gold fever, gun violence, alcohol, and horseshit. Listener discretion is advised.
The Tale of Jebeniah Jones. Part 1. It was an icy, cold wind that blew hard into his face. The weight of his pack, full of provisions, cutting into his back. A sled that took as much energy as he could muster was full of even more provisions that he dragged like a mule through the frozen forest. His legs burning in pain, his frozen feet crunching through the 2-foot-high, crusty snow. The sun was setting, and he was losing light. He found a large white spruce tree right off the old trail, with a tent-like canopy formed by its huge snow-covered branches. He crawled through the branches and out of the snow, and into the inviting natural shelter. The floor was a thick bed of pine needles, and the ceiling of 4 feet high was that of the large tree branches that drooped down to the snow line. It was the perfect place to shelter from the wintry outside with its biting wind. He wrapped himself inside his warm buffalo hides, lit a small stick fire, and stared into the flames. He could hear circling wolves howling in the darkness. He took a sip of whiskey and shook off the cold. He tried not to listen to their unnerving howls and closed his eyes. Took stock of where he was and where he wanted to go. And most importantly, what he wants to become. And that is rich. Like so many of his time, he was a dreamer, and his dream was gold. His name was Jebeniah Jones. Jebeniah was born in San Francisco in 1870. He worked in his father's tannery shop, Jones Tannery. He never knew his mother, as she passed away from yellow fever when he was 2. Life in the tannery was smelly, hot, and full of intense labor. It would take a long, long time for him to forget the stench of the place. He knew he wanted a change, as he didn't want to end up like his father, beaten down by life, just living day to day. That change came when he and many others heard the news of gold. Yup, gold in the Klondike. Why, you could just pick up nuggets as big as your fists, and all you needed was your own 2 hands to do so. Or so the San Francisco Chronicle claimed in a front-page story about the gold discovery. That's it. That's my ticket out of here, he said to himself. He took out his life savings, and at 20 years of age, he found himself on the steamship Victoria, headed for the Yukon and the fields of gold. He crawled out from his warm and cozy spruce tree bivouac, out into a cold, sunny morning. He felt a sense of relief, knowing that this would be his last trip of lugging supplies up to the scales, as he has been doing for 3 months now. The scales are where Alaska crosses over into Canada on the Chilkoot Trail. There, Canadian Mounties weigh your supplies and make sure that you have enough to survive in the Yukon for 1 year. Each stampeder, the name given to those headed towards the goldfields, must have at least 1 ton of supplies to be granted access into the Yukon and the fields of gold. The Mounties did this to prevent mass starvation, knowing what lay ahead for these unprepared stampeders. The Mounties weighed Jebeniah's provisions on the scales, and he was 2 pounds over the 1 ton limit. So he was good to proceed into the Yukon. He decides to camp at the scales for the night and tackle the daunting climbs of the Chilkoot Pass in the morning. The Chilkoot Pass is the steepest, narrowest part of the Chilkoot Trail. He kept to himself that night as other stampeders drank, fought, cussed, and shot guns into the air around giant bonfires. Things settled down at around 3 a.m., but at 4 a.m. the commotion started up again as Jebeniah heard a violent fight break out between 2 men. In the morning, the incident was revealed. Big Bill did not have enough supplies to get past the Mounties and into the goldfields, so he went about stealing provisions from other stampeders in the middle of the night and was caught red-handed. Unfortunately for Bill, the stampeders have their own strict set of codes and rules they live by, and stealing is an act punishable by death. At daybreak, Big Bill would be hanged. The sun rose, a crowd gathered. A noose was thrown over one of the beams of the scales. They made Big Bill stand on a wooden box with his hands tied behind his back. The noose slipped around his neck. He stared wildly at the gathered crowd as the stampeders taunted him. The hangman asked him if he had any last words. He paused and then said, "I hope all your souls find no rest and forever wander in the gloom of death." When he said these words, he was looking directly at Jebeniah. The look sent a chill down Jebeniah's spine. With that, the hangman yelled out, "So long, Bill," and kicked out the box under Big Bill, leaving him swinging from the neck, his eyes still affixed on Jebeniah, even as he breathed his last breath. After the scales and the many arduous backbreaking climbs on the 1,500 steps carved into the ice and snow up the Chilkoot Pass, Jebeniah finally got his last load on top, breathed a sigh of relief, and said, "The air is grateful, and this seems like another country." And in fact, it was. He was in Canada. He then floated the 445 miles down the Yukon River on a homemade raft that he built with 2 other stampeders that he became friendly with, Pat Pike and Mike Wolf. They floated through a stunning landscape of far-off snow-covered mountains that glowed in the sun. They passed sheer granite faces, dark, deep woods of birch and spruce, waterfalls and beautiful northern lights at night. The river is always taking them closer and closer to their destiny. They floated in this way for 20 days and 19 nights, arriving in the town of Dawson Spur on May 25th, 1897, the town where they believed they would find their fortune. They pulled ashore, where many other stampeders crowded the sandy beach. Jebeniah left his supplies on the beach with Pat and Mike and went into town to get a lay of the land. Walking down Dawson Spur's Main Street, Jebeniah saw a place that was crowded with people, horses, mules, wagons, and mud, and most of all, horse shit. The place smelled of wood smoke, bacon, and outhouses. And horse shit. Jebeniah passed Duffy's Dry Goods, the Dawson Spur Bank, the Claims Office, the Nugget Hotel, Dawson Stables, and the North Star Saloon, where he stopped for a whiskey and information. He inquires to the patrons of the North Star Saloon where a good place to start prospecting in the area might be. He soon learns that all of the prime locations were already claimed a year ago. This was not the news he wanted to hear. Now he knows that he will have to venture farther out from town, farther out into the wild, where chances of finding gold are more uncertain and the surroundings more dangerous. He sipped his whiskey and started to wonder if maybe he made a big mistake coming here. He snapped out of his sad thoughts when someone crashed into him. Mean old Tom was drunk again and started a fight with Pesos Pete, who crashed into Jebeniah. Pete got up and started towards Tom, fists in rage. Mean old Tom pulls his revolver and shot Pete in the leg. Pete fell to the floor, right under Jebeniah. Jebeniah tried to help Pete. He was bleeding badly from his leg. He probably got shot in the artery. Jebeniah removed his belt and applied a tourniquet to stop the bleeding. Pete was screaming and losing a lot of blood. Jebeniah tightened the tourniquet as tight as he could and held Pete's hand and told him to hang on. Pete started looking pale as the crowd gathered. Pete looked into Jebeniah's eyes and started speaking directly to him. "I see you. You'll never rest. You'll never rest." He was now looking past Jebeniah, or more like looking through him. Pete's eyes opened and closed, and then stayed closed in what Jebeniah thought was Pete's final moment. He was about to lay Pete's head down when suddenly Pete looked directly at him one more time and then stuffed a piece of paper in his hands. "It's yours now. Good luck. And try not to die," he said. With that, Pete slumped over and died. Jebeniah opened his hand, and in it was the paper Pete gave to him. It was the deed to Pete's claim, ironically called Dead Man's Gulch, a piece of land on a small nameless stream that feeds into Mirror Lake some 5 miles out of town. The witnesses in the bar, including William Stahl, the claims officer, all agreed the claim, Dead Man's Gulch, was Jebeniah's claim now. Jebeniah went to Dead Man's Gulch with all his supplies, the only way there was from town, and that was the hand-cut trail that Pesos Pete built. 3.5 miles through a dense, mostly flat forest, and the last 1.5 miles around Mirror Lake to the other side where Dead Man's Gulch lay. The claim, Dead Man's Gulch, consisted of a 1-room, 10 by 12 ramshackle shack, half buried in the side of a hill and made of hewed logs and a moss-covered roof. Inside was a dirt floor, a small pot-belly stove, table, chair, and shelves of provisions. It sat on the edge of Mirror Lake and right next to an unnamed stream that had a large gold sluice set up on it. Looking straight at the claim with your back to Mirror Lake, The shack would be on the right. In the middle, the stream with the sluice. And to the left, a tunnel that Pete dug into the side of the hill for another way to find the gold, instead of relying on just sluicing. Jebeniah brought the chair from the cabin outside and sat in it at the edge of Mirror Lake and watched the sun go down. The sunset reflected perfectly off the aptly named Mirror Lake. Tomorrow would be Jebeniah's first day of prospecting. Jebeniah woke at sunrise and went right to sluicing for gold. He quickly realized that gold sluicing is a quiet conversation between man, water, and earth. The cold creek water rushes down the wooden trough. Gravel shudders and rolls, stones knocking together like dull bells, while mud lifts and drifts away in brown clouds. The lighter things are carried off downstream, but the heavy ones, patient, stubborn, sink and stay. The heavy ones are, in fact, the gold. Jebeniah sluiced from sunup to sundown, and at the end of the day, had a 1/4 gram of gold flake. If this first day was any indication of the days to come, then Dead Man's Gulch was going to be the answer to Jebeniah's dream. He went to town the next day to celebrate. As Jebeniah celebrated more and more, he became increasingly tipsy. He was buying people drinks and having a great time, and at one point got up on the table and shouted, "I am Jebeniah Jones, and I am going to be rich!" He immediately fell off the table after that declaration. He picked himself up and stumbled to the Nugget Hotel, checked in, and slept it off. As the months rolled by, Jebeniah repeated this pattern of prospecting, finding some gold, going to town, and spending a large portion of his gold dust at the North Star Saloon. He was settling into this routine and happy that he was finding his way in the world. And as backbreaking as the work was, he still preferred it over his father's tannery. Prospecting, going to town, coming back to his claim. The months rolled by and winter set in. Jebeniah started to mine in the cave as the stream froze up and sluicing season was done for the year. The cave had its own set of challenges that Jebeniah had to learn to deal with. Of course, it was dark, cold, wet, and just plain miserable. But more than that, Jebeniah thought that the cave had a life of its own. Like sometimes when he held his breath, he swore he could hear breathing somewhere deeper inside the cave. Even the candles that he used for light would eerily flicker with the cave's breathing. Time also seems to slow once inside the cave. He noticed that the breaths of fog coming out of his mouth would disappear, sucked straight back into the blackness of the cave. He always worried that the cave would just swallow him up, and no one would even know. That's actually what kind of happened one very cold evening, as Jebeniah was trying to break apart a large boulder that was in the middle of the cave that he thought would reveal the mother lode. Yeah. hammered away at the giant boulder, striking it over and over again, using all his strength, the hammering echoing off the walls. One of the echoes was answered by a low rumble from far off in the cave. The rumble grew closer and closer, and then hit Jebeniah with a thud that knocked the air out of his lungs and slammed his body to the ground, pinning his legs under rocks and gravel. When Jebeniah opened his dirt-filled eyes, he could only see blackness. The candles were out, and he felt a large weight on his legs. He began to panic when he realized he didn't even know which way was up, down, or even out. First, he dug his legs out, rolling the large rocks off his legs. Then he started digging with his hands in what he only guessed was the way out. After what seemed like a lifetime of clawing at the earth with bleeding hands and choked lungs full of dust, he finally saw a ray of light. He put his hand through the tiny hole where the light was, then his arm, and finally pushed his body through, crawled out into the light and the sweet air, limped into his shack, and passed out in bed from exhaustion. This concludes the tale of Jebeniah Jones, Part 1.
Thanks for listening to Hothead Horrors. I release a new tale once a month. Please like and subscribe to keep the horror coming. You can also listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Stop by hotheadhorrors.com to pick up some merch if you like.